Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending what is our third session of the Woolf University Post-Kantian Philosophy Seminar. The seminar meets once a month, typically on what's the last Wednesday of the month. And the sessions, including this one, are recorded, so they'll be available for viewing later. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Matthew Clemente from Boston College. Matthew is a prolific writer. He has a monograph that came out in 2019 called Eros Crucified: Death, Desire, and the Divine in Psychoanalysis and Philosophy of Religion. It's a really good book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And he's also the editor of a number of volumes, including with Richard Carney, The Art of Anatheism, Richard Carney's Anatheistic Wager, Philosophy, Theology, Poetics, and then two additional volumes, one of which is entitled Misreading Plato, and the other is entitled Misreading Nietzsche. His work is primarily in phenomenology, existentialism, and psychoanalysis. And today, Matthew is going to be giving a talk on Camus called Rebels Dwell in a Dry Land, Living in Exile with Camus.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for having me and inviting me here. It's a huge honor for me. I'll try and make the talk pretty conversational and just tease out some ideas. I've been drawing from Camus over the past few months as I've been working through his corpus. And then I would really love to have kind of a rich conversation at the end. I think philosophy is much better done when you're talking to other people than when you're talking. So as much as I like the sound of my own voice, I hope that you'll all come in and help me kind of carry us through the finish here. I'll just have two quick notes to begin with. The first is that I'm just getting over a bit of a bout of COVID. So if my throat kind of cracks at any point, I apologize for that. The second is that my wife will be bringing in my daughter from preschool in a bit. I've told her to do the best she can to keep her quiet, and hopefully she'll do a good job with that. But my daughter's 4, so you never know what kind of interruptions you can expect in the middle of something like this. So I apologize in advance for that. Today, I'd like to really unpack some of the central ideas that I see Camus drawing forward in his philosophical works, particularly the Myth of Sisyphus and the Rebel. And then also a talk he gave. He made one trip to America just after the war, I want to say in 1946. He came to Harvard and Columbia and traveled around. He was kind of sent by the French government to let people know what's going on in France, and in some ways encourage some tourism, invite people to come back to France as they're reconstructing post-war. And he gave a beautiful talk called The Human Crisis, which actually Viggo Mortensen did a recording of on the, I want to say, 70th anniversary of it. It's available on YouTube, so definitely worth listening to at some point. So I'm just going to kind of talk a bit freeform here, but pull together some central ideas and central themes that are really important to Camus, and talk about what he's after and what he's trying to construct in his philosophy and trying to articulate. Camus' first major philosophical work is The Myth of Sisyphus, and he writes this in the early years of World War II during the occupation. And he begins by telling us that the central question for philosophy, and really the central question of human existence, for all human beings to grapple with, is the question of, is life worth living? The thing that stands behind all philosophical ideas and all of the kind of arcane philosophical arguments we have, metaphysical, whatever, the thing that stands beneath them, Camus asserts, is the question of whether or not we ought to go on living. And this immediately raises a secondary question, or seems to suggest a secondary question, which is, does life have a meaning? So when Camus begins The Myth of Sisyphus, he wants to get to boil things down to the essence of things. Let's get to the heart of the matter. Let's talk about the fundamental philosophical predicament and really the fundamental human predicament. Human beings are confronted by this question, Camus thinks, at various points throughout our lives. And really, the essence of human life comes down to answering this question. is life worth living? So he starts with that question, is life worth living? And he says immediately the secondary question that this draws us into is there a meaning for human existence, for our lives individually, and for history, for human beings collectively? It's by answering that question, he thinks, that we can get back to the primary question of, is life worth living? And he says what he wants is to construct a philosophy that remains honest about human experience and about life as it presents itself to us. So much of the philosophical conversation and abstraction, Camus thinks, amounts to trying to answer these questions by moving away from the human predicament, the human condition, how life presents itself. But what Camus wants is a philosophy that grapples with life as we experience it without any flight into any abstract ideas. He wants to deal with concrete experience. When we ask the question of whether or not life has a meaning, we're asking the question of not just whether there is some meaning to existence, but is there a meaning that's decipherable to me, that I can understand and articulate? When I think about my own life, can I make sense out of it in terms of some order, some recognizable meaning that structures my existence and that helps me to say, put the pieces together such that when something happens in my life, good or bad, that thing fits into some sort of higher harmony or articulation of my life, some sort of narrative structure that helps me to make sense out of my experiences. Do things fit together? Do they cohere? You know, in daily conversation, when something bad happens, we'll say something like, oh, everything happens for a reason. And this gives us a sense that even the problematic parts of life, even if we don't understand them today, we will ultimately have some sense of how these things fit together. And Camus wants to be really rigorous and say, well, let's ask ourselves, let's stick with life as it presents itself and ask ourselves, is that the case? This is the question that has to be asked and answered first and foremost. He begins the myth of Sisyphus by talking about an experience that he says all of us have at times, one that we're not aware of most of the time, but that will break in on life and interrupt our lives. And that's the experience of the absurd. Now, let me explain a little bit of what he means by this. In your daily life, in your daily routine, things happen in a way that makes sense. The thing that's most apparent about human beings is that we order and structure our lives in a very logical and consistent way. If you think about human life, your own life, I mean, don't think abstractly about human life. Think about your own life. Think about what a typical day looks like for you. The fact that I can say something like a typical day means that your life has an order to it, kind of a rhythm to it. You wake up around the same time. So for me, I get up every morning around 5. I come down and make coffee. I get my teeth brushed. I get myself put together. I run the dog who needs to be run or else he's going to be jumping all over the kids. I come back. I start making their breakfast. I get them off to school. I come home and get myself ready for work, right? Like your life has a pattern and a consistency to it. And typically, you know, the pattern will change a little bit with weekends and with work, but you have an order and a structure to your life that makes sense. You have that individually, and we have that collectively. We build an order and a structure to life that helps us to make sense out of it. So an example that I always give my students of this is, I don't know if everyone in the audience is from America, but in America, we walk on the right side of a hallway, just like we drive on the right side of the road. We do that kind of unconsciously because it actually helps us to make our way through the world. There's nothing more frustrating than when someone's walking on the wrong side of the hallway toward you it breaks up that expectation that life will be orderly, that it will go the way that I expect, the way that I plan. So much of our lives are constructed in a way that makes sense. And we bring that ordering to existence. We bring that kind of coherence to our lives. Now, what happens, Camus says, is, and what will happen to everyone at different points, is that something will break in on that experience, something that he calls the experience of the absurd, that undermines the order, that undermines the structure that we've built into our lives, and awakens us to a truth that we've been neglecting. And the truth is that life is not orderly, but chaotic. So for instance, I have my daily routine. I go through the process every day. It works for months on end. You know, I get the kids to school on time. I keep my commitments. I get to my job. And then one day, 2 weeks ago, I'm sick with COVID. And everything explodes. I can't do anything. All of the sudden, the very rigorous structure that I've built into my life to help me make sense out of life collapses in upon itself. Something upends the order. Now, this can happen in a whole bunch of ways, Camus thinks, right? If you get into a car accident, it can jar you out of your normal expected way of experiencing things. I've been in car accidents that seem to have happened for no reason, right? Someone sneezed actually, and it caused a car accident that I was in. That's such an absurd reason for the order to break down, just someone sneezing, right? So it can happen in those types of ways that we have the experience of the absurd. This is not what Camus would define as absurdity itself. I'll get there. But the experience of the absurd is something that breaks up the normal feeling that we have, that the world makes sense and that we're at home in the world. I'll give a couple other examples that he touches upon that help to articulate it, to show that it's not just an accident or a calamity, right? Before I had my dog, I lived in a different neighborhood. I was used to going out during the day. But one night, I had to go to the store and I didn't feel like driving. I was within walking distance. I don't typically do that. So I'm walking back from the store. It's nighttime. And now all of a sudden, I'm in my neighborhood, the neighborhood I had lived in for years, but at night. And everything took on kind of a pernicious air. I felt scared walking down my street. Things were dark. I didn't recognize the neighborhood that I lived in. It looked very different. All of a sudden, I'm having this experience, Camus says, that awakens me to the fact that things are not what I expect them to be. That the world is not what I believe it to be. What I believe it to be in my daily life is orderly, rational, something that I can interpret, something I can manipulate in ways that serve my ends and my purposes, something that makes sense to me. That's how I typically move through life. There's a pattern that helps me make sense out of it. But suddenly, something undermines that. I see things differently. Camus says this can happen in relationships. You know, I've been married now for almost a decade. So you're with your spouse, someone you know very well. And we've all had this experience where you're looking at your family member, your significant other, and all of a sudden, she looks different than I remember. There's something alien about her. There's something that I don't recognize. This person who every day I know in these certain ways is different to me. It can happen with your own reflection in a mirror. You see yourself differently. You say, is that what I look like? I don't look like that. It startles you. It jars you out of what you expect. These feelings, Camus says, are expressions of or experiences of the true nature of existence. And the true nature of existence is that it resists our attempts to order it and make sense out of it. The true nature of existence is, the old Shakespeare quote from Hamlet, there's more in life than your philosophies can contain, Horatio. Something like that, I'm paraphrasing. We move through life as if it makes sense to us until it doesn't, until it surprises us. We can be surprised by joy too. You can be not expect to fall in love, and then you do, and it startles you. It breaks up your routine and the pattern of your life. What Camus says is what these experiences of absurdity ultimately help us to see about life is that there's a fundamental disconnect between human beings and the world in which we live. What we want most, and if you actually are honest with yourself and kind of parse this out, you'll see that this is what you want. This is your deepest desire. What you want is for life to make sense. What you want is when something bad happens, is for it to be part of a bigger story. You lose your job and you immediately start rationalizing it and giving kind of a narrative structure to it. You say, this actually gives me the opportunity that I've been waiting for to pursue this. This one door closes and another one opens, right? Everything happens for a reason because I wasn't meant to be in that job. I wasn't meant to be with this person, right? And we start interpreting life in such a way that we fit things together as if there's a meaning to it, right? That's how we typically move through life and think about life. But the experience of the absurd breaks that up and undermines that. And what it shows us is that there's a divorce between human desire and the world. What I want most is for life to have a meaning. That's my deepest desire. I want it to be rational and interpretable and understandable. And when I look at the world as it actually presents itself, and not how I map an interpretation onto it, but how it actually presents itself, is that it's incapable of giving me what I desire. It is not coherent. It's chaotic. For Camus, there's obviously a lot of senseless suffering in life. That's the opposite of what human beings want. We're okay with suffering. We're actually pretty good with suffering, so long as it means something. I'll give an example. My wife and I were the main caretakers for her grandmother when she was in her 90s. And in the last couple of years of her life, she suffered horribly. She had dementia. She had all types of physical ailments. She was having repeated falls. There was all the indignity of being old, which is an awful thing for someone to experience. The thing she used to say to me all the time is, I must have done something really bad to deserve this. Now, what Camus says is, for human beings, even a bad reason is better than no reason. I must have done something bad to deserve this suffering is a terrible reason for why you suffer, from old age. That's an awful reason. It doesn't make any sense out of really the sufferings entailed in old age, but it's better to have that bad reason and more comforting to have that bad reason than the horror that we're confronted with that no, actually, you suffer for no reason. It's senseless why you suffer. Why someone gets cancer, why someone gets hit by a car, why someone whatever, it doesn't happen for a reason. It just happens. These things, Camus says, just happen. One more example, and you'll see, I teach these texts, so I'm trying always to bring in examples that resonate with my students. I was driving I live in Massachusetts. My parents own a small house on the Cape, which is a beach, by the beach. And I was driving down the Cape for a weekend to go do some writing by myself. I had been dying to do some writing. I have 3 kids, so I don't get as much time as I want. And my wife said to me, this weekend, go to the Cape, have your seclusion, do your writing. So I'm thrilled, right? Couldn't be more ecstatic. I'm driving down the Cape and I'm listening to music. I don't remember what I was listening to, but something that was really kind of like, I was really in the music. I was really, invested in it. It might've been some old Mumford and Sons or something like that, that really kind of had me going. And I'm driving down, there's no traffic on the highway. I love driving long distances. I'm really enjoying my ride. And I'm driving and I see this beautiful hawk. It was gorgeous. It flies down across the highway in front of me and lands in the median. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, God in heaven, this is magnificent. How lucky am I? How beautiful is life? That bird, I've never seen a majestic bird like this so close. And here I am driving to the Cape to write. Everything is going well. All of a sudden, and this is a true story, this is not a joke, the bird takes off from the median, flies directly in front of my car. I smash into it. And I don't know the rest of the ride, whether or not it's stuck in my grill, because all I know is that I hit it. I just crushed this gorgeous bird. Now, Camus would say, where's the meaning in that? Why did that happen? You know, what's the thing that experience is revealing to me about some deeper harmony in existence? Of course, there is none. The reality is that sometimes birds fly in front of cars and get crushed by cars, and that's terrible. But there isn't some higher, you know, order for Camus, at least none that we can recognize and interpret and pick up upon, that makes that okay and helps that to make sense. It's just a chance thing that happens. Life for Camus is full of these chance things. And so the underlying condition for human beings, and the thing that makes us different from any other being that we can at least observe, is that we want it to make sense. My dog, Joey, for the most part, doesn't seem like he's too concerned with whether or not life makes sense. You know, if there's food in his bowl, he's okay with that. But for me, just having food on my plate is not enough. I need it to be interpretable. I need there to be some meaning. So there's this fundamental disconnect, Camus says, between what I want and what I get, between me and the world. I realize that I live in exile. All of us do. In exile because my situation is such that I'm an alien in my own home. My home is the world, and yet I'm divorced from it. There's a disconnect between me and the world. I want a meaningful life. Life presents itself as meaningless and full of all types of chance occurrences. So to this secondary question that Camus raises at the beginning of Myth of Sisyphus, does life have a meaning? He answers, no, it doesn't, at least none that's discernible to us. It's possible, he's an agnostic really more than he is an atheist. It's possible that there is some God with some higher harmony that makes sense out of all of this. But if there is, that's not how life presents itself to me today. In my experience, that's not what I see. And so he wants to stay with the present moment and life as it expresses itself to me today. Well, this pushes us back immediately to the first question. If life has no meaning, does that mean that it's not worth living? Of course, Camus is writing after thinkers like Schopenhauer and a whole nihilistic philosophy and movement that swept through Europe, who answered that question in the negative. Because life has no meaning, therefore, it's not worth living. Their answer is despair. You know, it's a metaphysics of despair, basically. Camus says, well, we need to ask this question. We can't satisfy ourselves with that answer, that the logical conclusion and necessity of a meaningless existence is despair and ultimately suicide, that because life has no meaning, therefore it's not worth living, I ought to kill myself, which is what Schopenhauer, of course, advocated. Or if not kill myself in actuality, kill myself, commit suicide in a different way by drowning my sorrows in drink or by believing things that are obviously false, giving way to illusions that help me cope with things, right? Some sort of flight from existence. That's not necessarily the answer or the solution. So we need to ask that question. We've gotten rid of or recognized, honestly, the meaninglessness of existence, but does that lead to the conclusion of despair? And Camus wants to say no. In the face of meaningless existence, we realize, if we're honest with ourselves, if we remain conscious of our plight, that we're the only beings capable of recognizing the absurdity of existence and of keeping it conscious, of bringing this problem to light. We're the only ones who can do that. And we're the only ones who, in the face of it, are capable of saying, and yet I reject it. Let me articulate this a little better than I am right now. Here are some alternatives Camus believes are possible for people when we recognize the absurdity of our predicament, most of them amounting to the same thing. The first, so let's take an actual example of a real person, right? Me, okay? I have my orderly life, things make sense, my life is going well, I'm happy with the structure. Something terrible happens that reveals the absurdity of existence to me. A family member of mine dies suddenly and unexpectedly, right? This is a real example, okay? So that happens. Now I'm confronted with the absurdity of existence. I'm confronted with the fact that my life doesn't make sense the way that I expected it to. I didn't expect this person to die. I expected this person to live. I expected to have a long, happy relationship with this person. Now, the world presents itself to me as not giving me what I expect, not giving me what I desire, but actually giving me chance accidents that take this person away from me. What do I do about that? There are multiple flights, escapisms that I could give way to, right? One would be to just not think about it. And this is something that we do when we're struggling with something awful that's happened. You know, when I've lost other people at other points in my life, I've said, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to suppress it. I can't deal with it. I'm not going to deal with it. So I push it down. So I have a kind of denial of the reality. I don't keep the absurdity of existence in mind. I push it away. I can do that by simply repressing it, simply just, cutting off and acting like it hasn't happened and that I haven't been hurt by it and that I haven't been crushed by it. I can do that by making some sort of religious leap. I can say, well, this person died unexpectedly, but now he's an angel in heaven and he's got his place and God has granted him, the thing that I want. What a blissful thing, actually. Death is not a bad thing. A surprise death is not a terrible thing. It's actually a good thing because now he's one of the saints and all of that. And I can make that kind of flight and leap, which I don't have any evidence for in, faith, of course, is in some ways in Kierkegaardian terms of this type of leap, but I don't have evidence for it in my immediate life. In my life, when I see the dead body of my loved one, when I see the corpse and I go to the funeral and I give the eulogy, the way life presents itself to me is that this person's dead, this person's gone. So to make that kind of leap of faith is a flight from life as it presents itself to me, Camus says. I can do that. I can recognize that my life has been interrupted, that the order has been undermined, but I can throw myself back into the order. So I can say, I'm going to go back to work. I'm just going to focus on my work, on my tasks, on my job, and get back into the daily routine and the daily grind as if this hasn't been the case. This interruption, this break of the absurd hasn't happened, right? I can do all of those things. Camus thinks all of them are tantamount to a type of intellectual suicide, because what they do is they destroy the realization, the conscious realization that I've had that life is absurd. They negate the problem. They deny the problem and they flee from it. They say the problem is too much for me. I can't handle it. I can't handle that life is not what I wanted and what I expect. I'm overcome by it, and I have to find some way to escape. I have to find some way to get out of this predicament. And of course, we find all different ways. I can rationalize it. I can build a whole philosophy, which philosophers are great at doing, and I'm good at doing this. I can construct a whole philosophy that makes sense out of the loss of someone, the suffering that I experience, whatever. And actually, philosophy is a great antidote for a lot of suffering. It's really a very helpful thing. So I can do that, right? I can rationalize it away. Or Camus says, I can do the most difficult thing of all. And yet the crowning achievement for Camus of human life. I can be honest about the situation. I can be honest about how crushed I am by it, and yet refuse to look away from it. I can say, this senseless suffering has befallen me. It's destroyed my belief in the order of existence. It's destroyed my belief in the meaning of life. And yet, I'm going to continue to keep it conscious, and I'm not going to let it overcome me. I can be honest. I can be honest in a way that human beings find almost impossible to do, right? We have such a tough time with this, being really boldly honest about our suffering. I think a great, I pulled the title from this talk today from the Psalms, but I think a great example of this type of honesty comes in the book of Job. Someone who's lost everything and who says, I'm not going to be satisfied with a simple explanation and a simple answer. If you know the story of Job, it's the story of someone who refuses rational explanations and yet also refuses to succumb to despair. It doesn't say my life is over and it's not worth living, but continues to question and keep the trauma and the problem and the loss and the suffering present, always, right in front of them. Camus says this is the pinnacle of what human beings are capable of. Now, just this awareness and this recognition of the absurdity of life and the disappointment that we feel in the face of the terrible fates that can befall us. Now, he says the best posture that we can assume is that of revolt, conscious revolt. And conscious revolt means recognizing the truth of the absurd nature of human existence, and yet not giving in to despair. Not allowing it to overcome you. Picking up your burden every day and carrying it forward, honestly, acknowledging it, and yet shouldering on, saying life is still worth living, actually. Answering that first fundamental question, is life worth living or not? In the affirmative, yes, life is worth living because actually of the fact that it's chaotic and fickle and not what I expect. And because of the fact that I am capable of bearing that cross of existence. I'm capable of doing it. This idea of revolt that he sets up in the myth of Sisyphus, he begins to really articulate and unpack in both the talk I gestured at before, The Human Crisis, and then in a much more thorough way in his second real philosophical treatise, Rebellion. The idea is this, that he starts to take up. We recognize the absurdity of our position. We recognize the fact that the world is incapable of giving us what we desire and long for. We don't allow that fact to crush us. In fact, we live in constant opposition to it, in rebellion against it. In the same way as he gives the example of a slave in rebellion. So let's unpack the example for a second to help us articulate the posture that he thinks human beings ought to assume in the face of the absurdity of existence. When a slave revolts against the person enslaving him, What he does is, Camus says, is he says two things, no and yes. No to your demand. No to your command that I do X. Yes to myself and my worth and my value. In the moment of revolt or rebellion, what the slave in revolt does is says, although I have done what you've told me for so long, we've now reached the line where I say no more. I won't accept it anymore. By saying that, what he's doing is affirming his own worth. He says, no to your demands because I don't deserve to be treated this way. It's an affirmative posture, actually. The no is a yes. It's a yes to my own value and the value of my life. It says my life is worth living, is what it says. I'm worth living and not being treated this way. Now, what's interesting is about the revolt and the rebellion that Camus thinks arises out of kind of a real conscious awareness of the absurdity of life is in Myth of Sisyphus, what he's doing is he's giving us a metaphysics of the world. This is the way the world is. And how do we respond to the way that the world is and how it presents itself to us? We respond by revolt, by saying, no, I reject the world as it is. I won't allow it to crush me. I'll say, yes, there's a dignity to me and a value to me that can stand in opposition to the absurdity of life and the absurdity of the world. I'm worth more than this crushing fate wants to push down upon me, so I'll revolt against it. But what he does in rebellion, in the rebel, I'm sorry, the text is the rebel. What he does in the rebel is he builds this into an ethics. He takes the metaphysical ideas he unpacks in Myth of Sisyphus, and he builds it into an ethics and says, what rebellion does, when I say, no, I won't be treated this way anymore, or no, I won't accept the absurdity of existence, I'm going to live in opposition to it. What I do is not only assert my own value and the worth and value and dignity of my life, I actually begin to make a claim, a universal claim about human beings and their worth and their dignity. This is how. A slave in rebellion says, no, I won't do what you're saying anymore, even if you kill me. When I make that move, when I make the move from I won't do this anymore to I won't do this anymore, even if you put me to death, even if you end my life, what I'm saying is, not only do I have a dignity that shouldn't be trampled by whatever it is you're forcing upon me, but that dignity is so important to me that I recognize its worth as being more valuable than my own life because it's a value for everyone else. Not only should I not be treated this way, no one should be treated this way. Now, that's the example he gives is between the master and the slave. He has Hegel in mind. He's working through that dialectic. But apply that to life, right? A terrible tragedy befalls me. The absurd has cut in on my life, and it has taken the veil away from my eyes. It's shown me the meaninglessness of my existence. And yet I say, no. As traumatic as this is, as tragic as this is, I'm not going to give in to despair. I'm not going to allow myself to pretend that this isn't the case. This suffering is the case, and it is senseless. I'm going to be honest about it, because there's a value in me that needs to resist this, that needs to shine a light on this and always live in opposition to it. When I do that, Camus thinks, when I rebel for my own sake and for my own dignity, what I'm communicating to others is that their lives too are worth living in the face of pain, living in the face of finitude, living in the face of suffering. I suggest that to others by my own willingness to carry the cross of existence, right? I suggest it to them, but I also see it in them. Once I start being honest about my own suffering, about the calamities that have befallen me, when I can speak about them honestly and live with them in my mind honestly, then I can see the suffering of others much more clearly. And I can say, this person too is like me. Another person put in a horrible position, in an absurd position, who is facing a crushing fate. And it's my job and my responsibility and my obligation, actually, to try and help that other person carry that, to try and help that other person shoulder that problem. It not only reveals the dignity of myself, it helps me to actually, honestly sympathize with others and see the suffering of others and the fate that others are living through and working through. There's a great, I'll probably end with this and then I'll, hopefully have some good conversation here. There's my favorite book by Camus is The Plague. It's his novel. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a breathtaking book. At the end of the novel, one of the characters, the plague has finally been lifted. So many people have died. The main character, Dr. Rieur, has been caring for the sick and dying. And one of the characters who recurs throughout the book now, he's a criminal. He's been kind of on the lam. And the plague has actually given him a lot of shelter. And actually, he's the one person who's happy about the plague, because when people are worried about the plague, they're not trying to hunt out criminals who are in hiding, right? So he's been able to kind of live on the lam without any problems, so long as the plague has been around. But the plague's now lifted. And the book almost ends with, it's like the penultimate scene. He's in a shootout with the police. And Dr. Rieur says to one of his friends, he sees this happening, and he says, the only thing more pitiable than an innocent man being condemned is a guilty man being condemned. It's such a fantastic and moving line, because in that recognition of this person who's guilty, who's done horrible, atrocious things, yet coming to justice, which, it is a form of justice to have him arrested. Rieur has pity on him and says that there's a way that I can understand and sympathize with even the guilty, because I know that in some ways his plight is similar to mine. He's responding in many ways to an unfair situation. He too has been born into a bad lot. He too has been confronted by the disappointments and absurdity of existence and of life. And so even though he's guilty, I can recognize my own struggle and my own suffering and my own faults in this person. It opens up a very moving and I think very compelling ethics. And Camus, more than anything else, is a moral thinker. He's a fundamentally moral thinker. And this is how the idea of kind of a radical honesty about the human predicament as it presents itself to us opens up a type of charity that I don't think we get in most thinkers. So these are kind of major themes and elements that Camus works out through his corpus, but obviously I'd be very happy to talk through any of them, hear any challenges or criticisms of Camus. I mean, he has his faults. I'd be very interested in what you think.
Magnificent talk. Awesome. So I have a number of questions that I want to ask myself at some point. But before I ask my questions, I want to open the floor to anyone else, to others who may have questions or comments for Matthew. And it's a smaller group today, so feel free to have follow-up questions and a little bit of a back and forth. So if anybody wants to say something, feel free to go right ahead. Okay, I will ask questions.
Great.
I think I had, at one point I had 4 questions. I'm down to 3, because one of my questions was going to concern Schopenhauer. And you touched on Schopenhauer about halfway through the talk, and you more or less answered what my initial question about Schopenhauer is going to be. Although I think I now have a different question about him as well. So my first two questions concern the issue of meaning, or the meaning of life, you might say as a whole. So I'm wondering what your view would be, what Camus would have to say about someone who claims that Camus' question, the existential question, does life have a meaning? Is there a meaning to life? Is somehow a category mistake, right? So I've seen people, they make this move, they say, well, it's a bad question because we can speak of events in life being meaningful or not, but to speak of life itself as such, as a whole, of having a meaning or not, that's just a bad question, a confused question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what Camus would say to that kind of response. And then relatedly, I'm thinking of someone like Heidegger, who in Being and Time brings in the phenomenon of death as a phenomenon that kind of challenges our sense-making abilities, right? So the idea for Heidegger is that because I'm going to die, there's a way in which I can never actually make potentially sense of my life as a whole, because of its finitude. So I'm wondering what Camus' response to that kind of concern is. How does he want to offer a view of the human life as a whole making sense or not in light of its finitude, or the phenomenon of death? And then I can save the Schopenhauer stuff for later.
Sure. So to your first question of whether or not it's a category mistake to ask about the meaning of life, I think Camus' response to that would be, whether it's a category mistake or not, this is the question that human beings ask themselves and that we pose to ourselves. And he wants to remain really true to the human experience. So like I said, when something bad happens, what is our first move? Our first move is not to say, well, this is meaningful in maybe this small context, or meaningless in this small context. Our first move is to totalize. That's what we do. So I'm being candid about recent deaths. My wife had a stillborn last summer, my son Anthony, and it was obviously completely unexpected. I was at the funeral, and a family friend came up to me, very, very kind woman. This is not a criticism of her at all. This is just an example that, I think serves the point. She came up to me after the funeral, and she said, every time you see a butterfly, there's your little boy, right? This is a very common response that people will give. It's an attempt, I think, that it's a very human attempt. I do the same thing, so it's not a criticism at all. But it's an attempt to take something terrible and make a more universal claim about it. This awful event can be made right, can be set right in the course of your life. If you remember that now you have a guardian angel looking after you, those types of answers that we hear. Or if you remember that these bad things, they give way to something else that's good. So you might say later in life, right? If, I don't know, we end up having another child or adopting or something like that, right? Like, oh, I never would have had this child if Anthony had been born. So now that thing makes sense in the frame of my whole life, actually. It's an attempt to make the question and rationality and reasoning of existence palpable for the span of my life. That's what I want. So I think Camus would say, well, whether it's a wrong question or a bad question or not, it is what we want. Let's attend to what we desire if we're honest with ourselves. What I desire is for my whole life to make sense and to be driving towards something. Right? I don't want to think of myself dying in some chance accident. I want to think of myself having completed my life's work and given myself to the things that I've set myself to do, and not dying. I mean, Camus, interestingly, as Stephen, he dies in an accident, a car accident, right? We want to think of ourselves as dying at the end of the story, when we've done everything that we were meant to do. We don't want to think of life being kind of haphazardly taken away, and that is a real possibility for us. So there's a fundamental desire within us for things to make sense in some sort of ultimate sense, for the story of our lives to be written. Think about how often people say things like, when I look back on my life, I want to know that I spent my time well, that I did the things that I cared about, right? That type of projecting to the end of my life implicitly assumes that I'm going to live a long, full life, and I'm going to be able to look back on it, and I'm going to be able to interpret its meaning, and it's going to mean what I wanted it to mean. And even the chance happenings that seemed chance at the time are actually going to come together in a way that helps me to make sense of it. It's a very human desire. So we want that. That's what we want. And Camus says that's very clearly not what we get. There's this divorce. As far as Heidegger's point about death being the thing that prevents me from having kind of the ability to interpret my life in a rational and meaningful way, I think Camus would agree with that. I think he would accept that. And he would say, given that that's the case, this raises the secondary question. Does that mean that because my life can't have any ultimate meaning, that it's not worth living? And so he, at least in Myth of Sisyphus, he answers the question in the negative. Life does not have a meaning very clearly. And yet, he wants to go through nihilism in a way to something that says life is still valuable, even if not meaningful. Life is still dignified, even if not meaningful. So I think that's how he'd kind of handle Heidegger there.
Great. I mean, let me just ask a follow-up, because you conclude by mentioning dignity, which actually has something, which is exactly what I wanted to ask about next.
Yeah.
So to bring in the Schopenhauer, I think you explained nicely that for Schopenhauer, the idea is that if life doesn't have a meaning, which according to Schopenhauer it doesn't, then life is not worth living.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that inference, as it were, that Camus rejects. Camus wants to say that life can be worth living, even despite its not having a meaning in a certain respect. And I want to ask whether or not Schopenhauer might just simply conclude or argue that, in a way, Camus then is still falling prey to self-deception. In other words, it's possible to recognize the absurdity of existence in the way in which Camus does, but then the entire subsequent effort of living life in some kind of conscious awareness of that absurdity still amounts to a kind of self-deception, because life isn't worth living. You're just living it anyway in the face of its not worth living.
Yeah.
That's my question. And then related to this is that it seems like maybe for Camus, this notion of dignity is somehow essential to working out why life can be worth living, even if it doesn't have a meaning. And I wonder what your views are about Camus' explanation for what the kind of source of that dignity is, insofar as Camus, of course, is rejecting views that would typically explain that dignity in terms of like the Imago Dei or something like that. How does Camus try to account for what he takes to be the dignity of human beings?
Yeah. So to your first question, I think the best critique of Camus and his whole project is to say that in spite of his protests on the meaninglessness of life, he still is asserting a type of illusory meaning. I think that's a very, very strong critique of this work. Interestingly, so in the talk that I mentioned, The Human Crisis, one of the things he says is that when we recognize the absurdity of existence, we recognize the predicament that we're in, that life doesn't have a meaning. And yet, he says, which is something he really criticizes existential philosophers for doing, particularly in Myth of Sisyphus, but he says it in the talk. And yet that leaves it to us to try and force meaning where there is none. And he'll talk in The Rebel about the world is not just. There is no justice. I mean, imagine, he doesn't give this example, but one that comes to my mind immediately. Think about the state of nature. Think about animals in the wilderness. Are they concerned with justice? No, of course not. The world is clearly fundamentally an unjust place. But he says in the Rebel, that leaves the space for human beings to fight for justice, right? So you could, I think it's very, very, there's a good critique of him that says for all of his protests about the meaninglessness of life, he's actually sneaking in the back door a type of illusory meaning that he says he wants to resist. You know, the idea that he ends Myth of Sisyphus by saying, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. So let me, for anyone who hasn't read it, let me lay out what this is. The myth of Sisyphus, this great Greek myth, is of a guy who's being punished by the gods. And the thing he's being punished for is loving life too much. He dies, the gods give him a chance to come back just to remedy one little thing. And instead, he hides out and he keeps living and he's not going back to the underworld. He doesn't want to die, right? So when they finally bring him down to the underworld, he's being punished. And his punishment is roll a boulder all the way up a hill to the top, spend all day working and slaving at pushing this boulder up the hill. Then when you get to the top, it's going to roll back down again. And you have to walk all the way down the hill and roll it all the way back up for eternity. Completely futile and useless work for all of eternity. That's your punishment. And Camus says, well, the gods kind of rightly assume that futile labor is a great punishment, that's a great condemnation, because shouldering on in the face of something that's not going to amount to anything is a horrible fate, unless we imagine what Sisyphus thinks about at that very moment when he stands at the top of the hill and he has to turn around and walk back down again. If we can imagine him saying, yes, it's a futile labor. I'm going to do it all over again. And yet, yes, I will do it again. At that moment, Camus says, Sisyphus becomes stronger than the gods, stronger than his punishment, better than his condemnation, because he's capable of taking something that's supposed to be a torment and turning it into his crowning achievement, his victory, by affirming it. All it takes is to be honest about it, say, I'm going to do it, and actually I choose to carry this burden. For Camus, that turns this into a victory. He ends very famously, Myth of Sisyphus, with one must imagine Sisyphus happy. I always get hung up on that word, imagine. Isn't that imagining Sisyphus happy another one of the illusions that he's trying to prevent us from, giving into? I think that's a very, very strong critique of Camus on this point. And yet I will say, again, from my own experience, that one thing that I've been amazed with over the past year, I've had a lot of family members who I care about deeply die over the course of my life. And usually I respond to loss in ways that Camus would say is flight. Since losing my son this past summer, I've said to myself, I need to be just completely honest about how terrible this situation has been for me, has been for my family. And I can't deny it. I have to be absolutely honest about how crushing it's been. And I will say, strangely, I've been much happier, not in a way that denies the suffering, not in a way that pretends like it hasn't happened, but in a way that there's a type of freedom that I think comes from honesty about a bad situation. And that's a really powerful insight from Camus on this. I think there's actually something existentially verifiable about that fact. Now, your second question, where does the dignity come from for Camus? I really think that for him, the dignity, it's a very Nietzschean idea. So anyone who's read Nietzsche, I think will understand in some ways what Camus is trying to do. It's a very, it starts off as a type of self-affirmation. I'm big enough to bear this burden and be honest about it. I can do it. I say yes to myself, I say yes to myself in the face of and in spite of a fate that wants to crush me. I say no to that crushing fate. And in saying no to that crushing fate, I say yes. I'm the author of my dignity. But the move that Camus makes that's very interesting in The Rebel is by being the author of my own dignity, affirming the value of my own life and my own, ability to bear this burden or whatever, what I do is I, in some ways, instill or recognize, I think he'd say recognize is a better word, the dignity that everyone else also has, because everyone else has the ability and the potential to do this same thing, to say, no, I don't accept this fate as leading to despair. Yes, I do accept my life as worth living in the face of a terrible fate. Everyone can do that, Camus thinks. And so that's really where our dignity resides, in that just that capacity to resist the terror of existence.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions? I see Sarah, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us, Philippe.
Yeah, hello, this is Felipe. I would like to just make a few comments. When you
Sure.
when you were talking about the divorce between the sense that we have about the world and the facts of the world, it comes to my mind a quote from Wittgenstein's on his notebooks from 1914 to 1916. On which he says, to believe in God means to understand the question about the meaning of life. Meaning to believe in God means to see that the facts of the world are not the end of the matter. To believe in God means to see that life has a meaning. And I was thinking about the rational constructions that we can make about our lives and what those facts give us, like safety, or that is structured on which we think that life is worth. But when everything goes like in the book of Job, what we have is something different than rational constructions, and it's to believe that even though we do not understand what is happening in our lives, there is a faculty that we as humans can have. It's to go beyond reason and have belief that it's not grounded in any structure of the world or any structure of our rationality. What would Camus think about that?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good question. So I'll say that in the first place, I mean, Camus is, for me, one of the few truly agnostic thinkers, in the sense of he's trying to bracket questions of belief, not to dismiss them. I think he's wrongly read often as an atheist. He's really not. He really is very much trying to remain within the limited human purview as much as we can. And questions of belief ultimately are questions of going beyond the human purview. They're human, humans believe, but it's making a movement into belief in something that transcends the human condition, belief in the transcendent. Camus not opposed to belief, and he doesn't say we shouldn't have them. His question is it possible to live without them? That's really his question. He's not making, at least in Myth of Sisyphus, he's not making a claim that we're better off for living without them or that we should. It's really, I take this text more than most philosophical texts. Most philosophers, maybe myself included, are good at starting with conclusions and then writing books that get to the conclusions that we want. I'm very good at that. Philosophers are very, very good at that. Camus says, I'm not going to start with any conclusions. My live without illusions. Now, illusions is not necessarily a negative word. Illusions can turn out to be true. We have illusions that ultimately are proved right? Like, I love just a silly example, but I love Michael Jordan. I grew up watching Michael Jordan. I watched The Last Dance, the documentary series on him. He's interviewed when he's first drafted by the Bulls, and he says, really happy to be drafted. I hope that now that I'm here, I'm going to bring a championship. We are going to bring a championship to the Bulls, right? He clearly already had this illusion that he was going to be great and that he was going to win titles, right? But that illusion served him well because ultimately that belief became true, right? Could religious belief be the same way? It's an illusion, but an illusion that maybe is proved right in the end and that, ultimately is shown to be true. Certainly a possibility that Camus would entertain. He's not opposed to that. But his question is purely within the human context, without any recourse to the transcendent, without any recourse to anything beyond what we experience. If we remain limited there, is it possible, and this is really a question he wants to ask, I don't think he starts with the conclusion that the answer is yes. I really think it's a good faith effort. Is it possible in that vein to be consistently honest, not succumb to illusion, and yet still want to live? Is that possible? And his answer is ultimately, yes, it is possible. And actually, you can live a very full life just by rebelling against the world as it presents itself. But he's a very, very fair thinker. I mean, he says often, if you pay attention in the text, he's making often these little caveats where he says, there's no reason why a good, faithful Christian couldn't also acknowledge and live in the face of the absurd. So long as they're not jumping into, well, everything now makes sense because God provides the answer, right? It's possible to be, think about the diaries of Mother Teresa, right? Where she's writing things like, life doesn't make sense. The suffering I see is meaningless, right? In that way, she's an absurd hero. She recognizes the senselessness of suffering and yet continues to care for the poor every day. That's Camus' ideal, So I don't think he's opposed to questions of belief. I think he's really trying to be rigorously honest about, let's stay within this frame. But it's a very good question. Sarah, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe it follows on from what you've just been saying. Yeah, thank you for your talk. I suppose my question is, do you think that Camus' account is in some ways phenomenologically quite narrow or quite binary, in that it seems that he has these categories of, the experience of meaning is necessarily this form of kind of narrativized meaning, that is projection, constructed meaning. It has that quality. It is, I guess, totalizing, to use Levinas's language. Or we have these breakthrough moments of the absurd that have a particular phenomenology, and they happen in human experience. And he is really strong in identifying that and the texture of that, and that's an important thing to wrestle with. But there seem to be these two categories, whereas again, for someone like Levinas, there's also the rupture of meaning that is itself meaningful, or there's different categories, different phenomenologies to different kinds of meaning that are also part of human experience, that people would say, I do have this experience where I thought the world was this way, and then I had this revelation from the outside kind of broke in and reordered my world, but it wasn't the absurd, it was almost a deepening or heightening or extending of a different kind of coherence. And then that potentially relates to the religious question, that it's not just we have this experience, and then if we want to kind of get something transcendent, we have to do this sort of leap, but rather there might be this presentation within our very experience. It is in our human experience that there's some more meaning of some kind. So I was just interested in what your reflections are on that.
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. I think phenomenologically speaking, Camus is offering a very rigorous account of a certain type of experience. But I was reminded as you were speaking of Sartre's letter on humanism, I'm sorry, existentialism as a humanism, his letter on existentialism, in which he talks about, he gives the example of someone who ultimately became a Jesuit priest, right? He tells a story, I believe the story, if I'm remembering it correctly, is that this person had a couple of calamities befall him. He loses a relationship, I don't know, loses a job all at the same time. And he says, in that moment, I realized with these calamities, taking place all around me, kind of disordering my life, that God was calling me to the priesthood. And Sartre says, well, that's fine. There's an interpretive move going on there, right? There's always something, to use a word that Sartre's not using, maybe Paul Ricoeur would use. There's always a hermeneutic being employed to interpret this. And what Camus wants to do is say, let's employ a hermeneutic that says nothing outside of the experience itself, nothing beyond it. Let's be as rigorous as we can be, right? What shows itself to me in this experience right now? And he says, and we can disagree with this, but he says in those experiences, it's not, what's coming forth is not a surplus of meaning, but the absence of meaning. He's very much, the examples he gives, he does gesture at the fact that, of course, a good thing could be an absurd encounter. But obviously, he's often talking about traumatic events that upend life. And he's trying to remain really kind of rigorously honest about those events. And he's bracketing any type of hermeneutic that would allow for some explanatory power beyond the event itself. Now, you might say, and I think it's a good point, and I've had experiences like this, I think maybe we all have, that there are experiences that bring with them, or seem to point within the experience itself towards something beyond it. I'll give an example. I talked about my wife's grandmother, who we were the caretakers for. She's dying, awful, a really excruciating death. I mean, it was very painful. I love this woman dearly, like she was my own grandmother. I mean, she became my family. Right? So in the last year of her life, as she's succumbing to dementia, she's talking less and less. She has no ability really to talk or communicate, nothing. I mean, I would sit with her sometimes for a couple hours and hold her hand, and she wouldn't even look at me. It was as if she wasn't there, right? Very, very painful. I'm doing that in the last month of her life. She's done nothing but yell and try and hit people and not really talk or anything. I'm sitting there, out of the blue, she turns to me, she looks me in the eyes and she says, "You see, it's not so tragic. Clear as day." What do you do with that? That's a bizarre experience, right? Like, that's an experience that actually suggests a meaning. The experience itself gives itself a experience. Camus doesn't, I think you're right, he brackets those. He doesn't deal with those. And that might be a fault, that might be a shortcoming. But what he's trying to do is say, human beings are great at, and this is where he's right about this. We're great at assuming a meaning immediately because it helps us cope. It's so helpful to have, as a coping mechanism, an answer for a terrible thing. It's just, we need it, And he wants to say, well, we might need it. Freud will say this, right? We need illusions. They're very, very, very important. They're fundamental. We need illusions. Camus wants to say, yeah, they might be really helpful, but is it possible to live without them? Is that possible, to be really, really transparent with ourselves, first and foremost? So, I think you bring in a fair criticism. There are experiences that seem to bring, what Marion will call a surplus of meaning right along with them. I think we can't deny that phenomenologically. he's going to bracket those experiences and say, let's not deal with those. Let's really stay in the events that don't suggest a meaning that we want to bring one to, but let's not bring a meaning. Let's not bring an answer, Yeah, that's an excellent question. What else? I'm here for as long as you want me.
Sarah, if you have a follow-up, feel free to ask, or anyone else. Maybe when everyone is thinking, I had a question. Well, so you mentioned throughout your talk and then also discussion, this phenomenon of illusion. And it's important, I think you mentioned that an illusion needn't be false. In the Michael Jordan example you gave, it proves to be true. I was wondering if you could just clarify for the audience the kind of conception of illusion you have in mind, such that an illusion doesn't necessarily involve its actual falsehood. I mean, it's kind of like a Freudian point, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then my other question would, Sarah had mentioned Levinas, and I was kind of struck too by maybe some of the kind of Levinasian resonances with regard to the ethics of kind of compassion or sympathy, or this kind of responsibility toward the other in virtue of the other's suffering. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about some potential interesting connection between Camus and Levinas in that regard.
Yes. Okay, great. So you're absolutely right that, I mean, for me, Freud is a foundational thinker for how I interpret things. So when I'm talking about illusions, I read Camus as someone who's dealing with, in many ways, similar questions and ideas as Freud. Think of The Future of an Illusion, one of Freud's more famous texts. In that, he's talking about religion as an illusion, of course, for Freud. And he's saying, we're at a point in history where the power of the illusion is waning. So we need a substitute. We need a new illusion that people can believe in order to help us cope with existence. And my reading of Future of an Illusion is that he's promoting science as a replacement illusion for religion. Now, to give you a little bit of what Freud's ideas are, is Freud's a fundamentally tragic thinker. He thinks the human condition is a tragic one, where, so very similar to Camus, we're born into a very bad lot. All types of chance and terrible things can befall us unexpectedly. And yet we have to carry on. That is a part of our plight as well for Freud, and an important one. And the way that we do it is with the help of an infinite number of illusions. We can have grand illusions, like about an afterlife, or the religious dogmas that Freud's going to attack. We have small illusions. So, for instance, this is just right now. This afternoon, I have work that I need to get done. I have in mind that I'm going to do it. I've planned for myself. I'm doing some editorial work that I find so tedious and painful that I need to get done, right? So I have to get some editorial work done today. I say to myself, by 4 o'clock, when I have to drive the kids to piano, I'm going to have these 4 essays read, edited, sent to the authors. That's an illusion. Why am I going to do that? There's no necessity that I'm going to do that. First of all, I never get done what I say I'm going to get done. I always say I'm going to get things done. I don't even come close. I mean, there's no way I'm getting this stuff done. But even if I do ultimately get it done, right? Even if I do, and I meet that goal, as of right now, at this moment, there's no necessity that I should do that. That projection of a future is fictive. There's no reality behind it. It's make-believe. I've made it up. And so for Freud, and I think Camus is operating with a very similar idea, all of the ways that we construct our lives, that we say, tomorrow, here's my checklist, here's what I'm going to do, all of the ways that we say, I'm going to follow the stop signs and the laws, right? The laws of our country and all of that stuff, they're fictions. They're make-believe. We make them up. They have no real substance. A great illusion that we all kill ourselves for and kill one another for is money. What is money? It's completely make-believe. It's it's nothing. It's air. It doesn't have any real value. What is it? If I said to you, I'm gonna dump you in the middle of the desert, but don't worry, you're 50 miles from civilization, 100 miles from civilization, but here's a suitcase with $10 million in it, good for you. You'd be like, what? This is an illusion. This doesn't mean anything, right? All of life is built upon small and big illusions. I project a future based on illusions. I think about myself in the past. All my memories are illusions. I don't remember things how they actually happened. I remember them how I liked them happening or didn't like them happening, right? So we live, and human life is trading on these illusions. We need them. And what Freud wants to say very, very clearly is our illusions are fundamental, valuable, people need them. We should give people good illusions, ones that are helpful. That's a basic thing for him. I read Camus as running against that and saying, is it possible to tear away as many of these illusions as we can? Which is why in Myth of Sisyphus, he talks about an example of the absurd man, someone who lives without illusions in many ways, is an actor on a stage, because the actor knows that he's acting. He knows that the money that he burns up is paper, is fake. He knows that the death-defying things that he's doing or the things that he's saying are meaningful are fake. So is it possible to live in such a way that we have the mentality of the actor always kind of at play? These things are not real, It doesn't mean we don't pretend and play along. An actor plays along, but we recognize that it's kind of, it's staged. To your question on Levinas, I hadn't really recognized the affinity between the two thinkers until getting ready to recently teach The Rebel. And I was struck by the same thing. There is this, for Camus, this fundamental responsibility for the other. Now, for him, of course, for Levinas, that responsibility comes from, in some ways, the other, right? The other presents the face of the other. I see the suffering face. The face is what calls me to responsibility. It's other first, primary. For Camus, it's a different starting point. When I recognize my own value, I immediately recognize everyone else's. When I recognize my own suffering, I immediately recognize everyone else's, if I'm honest about it. So it's a little bit different, like they're coming at a similar conclusion from different starting points, but I actually think there's a lot of interesting overlap on the ethical questions between these two thinkers. I think that's absolutely right.
Thanks. That's useful. I wanna thank everybody for having come to. David, do you have a question?
I just had two quick ones. I'm sorry. I wanted to jump in, and especially bouncing off Sarah's question, just because I was reading. So this past week I read Frederick Buechner, who's just like a writer that has a lot of anecdotes, and he had that same kind of experience you had with the kind of bird soaring, and he was driving in the New Jersey Turnpike and headed into the city, and just gives this incredible story about just blowing up his world. I mean, he just the sun and the way that the people are interacting and the way that the people are kind of swelling around him just leads him to think, this is kind of a day pregnant with meaning. And I know you're saying he's kind of bracketing those, but I'm just kind of wondering how he feels it's almost fair to have absurdity as a sort of hermeneutic lurking in the background of every single thing in life. Like, that's totally fair game. But the second that you have the opposite, any sort of positive valuation of meaning in life, it's just totally off the table. I think that's so strange that he allows a sort of a dominating presence of something that I guess in some ways is slightly metaphysical, right? And then it has these huge looming implications, but it can only be that, and it has to be kind of steered into that, but everything else becomes some illusion that is a sort of false faith or something. How, I guess, where does that in play? Second question is real simple, and it's kind of a weird one. One thing that's different about Camus versus lots of these other thinkers is that the man is like a rock star. Camus is good looking, extraordinarily bright and talented. His writing is razor sharp, and in his age, the man is, I mean, he's larger than life. He could have been in film, he could have directed, he could have done anything. Do you think in that way it sort of played into some of the way his writing led into absurdity, in maybe some sort of a imposter syndrome, or, you know what I'm saying, where people are looking to him as a godlike figure in his age, and he just felt like that sort of thing was undeliverable in terms of what he himself could produce in philosophy or writing? That's kind of a weird one, but
yeah. No. Two excellent questions. Your first one, in Myth of Sisyphus, one of the things he says, I want to stick with what I can know. It's a philosophical starting point for a lot of thinkers, right? It's Descartes. It's the old Cartesian starting point. But Camus is going to say what I can know is different from Descartes, right? Descartes thinks what I can know are my thoughts, my ideas. Camus says what I can touch with my hands and my heart beating within me. That's all I can know. What's immediately tangibly present to me, right in front of me. And he goes on and he's questioning the value of science and how, not the value of it, of course, valuable for human life, but the truthfulness of it, let's say. And he talks about how much of our scientific knowledge is based on abstractions, ideas that we construct, right? So much of life for Camus, his interpretation of life, is ideas that we construct, ways that we make up things to help us manage life. All I can know is what is immediately present to me, and what I realize when I actually attend to it is I don't understand it. I can know it's there, but I don't understand it. So he says, I know that my heart's beating within me, but I'll never understand my heart, meaning I don't understand myself, right? I don't know who I am. That's such a perplexing thing. I spend every minute with myself. I'm so vain that all I think about is myself. I don't think about anyone else really. And yet I don't understand myself at all. I have no real insight into who and what I am. And the things that I feel and touch, I know they're there. I know they resist me. When I hit this wall, I know it resists me. But do I know what it is? Do I know anything about it? No. If I'm being honest, I don't actually know anything about it other than that I can touch it. And so he wants to say, if I can't know these things that are immediately present to me, that means I can't know the meaning or have a good interpretation of anything. That's part of where his idea of the absurd comes from, this hermeneutic of the absurd, right? Everything that presents itself to me, if I'm honest, I realize I don't understand it. I don't. I want to. I wish I did. I wish I knew more about this windowsill and what it was made out of or whatever. But all of that stuff, those names I give to it and the ways that I manipulate it to help me understand it, are my constructions. They're not the thing itself. And so for him, that's